Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about gender as a social construction for Conflict 707, Gender and Violence. The goal of this mini lecture is going to be to highlight a few of the key points from the week's readings on the social construction of gender and its implications for understanding the relationship between gender and violence. So before we get into some of that, I wanted to just draw your attention to some of the different images that I've pulled here on the screen. I wanted to juxtapose, well, first and all, this is a tongue-in-cheek idea, right? That we would be talking about the construction of gender, and I'm going to pull a few images of folks in hard hats. But the reason I did that was not just to be cute and funny, but to also draw attention to the juxtaposition between the ways in which the women are viewed, or displayed, I'm sorry, the women are displayed, and the men are displayed here. So we can see that this woman is giving us this kind of sexy come hither glare, and she's holding a drill. We could all, brainstorm on what that might mean or not mean for the implications of her sexual gaze here. And then we have this other woman looking beautiful and friendly and wearing diamond jewelry and presumably about to go onto a construction site. So I don't know about you when you're about to get down and dirty, but I generally don't wear a business suit and earrings. For me, what this image says is that she's friendly, approachable, but also probably not too scary or intimidating. And this woman is clearly gaining her power from the fact that she is sexy and alluring. Whereas we have these two images of men here. This man to me looks authoritative and in control, and he's giving us this kind of I know what I'm doing glare, as opposed to this woman here who's giving us this friendly, approachable, I can be talked to, welcoming grin. Then we have our friend down here, the firefighter, with his helmet off to the side, who's clearly drawing his authority from his ability to be muscular and dominating, and he's really giving us the air of I know what I'm doing, I'm in charge, because he's big and physically overpowering and dominating. So I just wanted to call your attention to kind of the different ways in which the women are presented here in vis-a-vis the men. Furthermore, we can talk a little bit about that throughout the course of the class and the discussions, but did just want to give you some images to get you thinking about the ways in which gender categories are constructed, not just through discursive means, as Butler will talk about later, but through the images that we see. So getting into the specifics. As I said, the goals of this lecture are going to be to highlight key points from the week's readings, especially as they pertain to the concept of gender construction and key theories informing our understanding of this idea. We're going to explore the implications of the readings on our understandings of gender and violence throughout the discussions as well as in the concluding thoughts. So moving first, before we get into the fine points of the reading, let's discuss why understanding gender as a social construction, that is, a system produced through social interactions and institutions, rather than something that exists naturally or inevitably, is so vital for understanding the relationship between gender and violence. Fundamentally, the social construction of gender is about power. Who can claim social power? Who is marginalized or excluded from it, and who has the legitimacy and ability to define the social roles that undergird these categories. Conflict analysis and resolution theorists who draw attention to the influence of gender in conflict have built upon theorists from across academic disciplines who've been thinking about the influence of gender on both individuals' lived experiences as well as the institutional structures and cultural institutions which comprise society. The framing of gender as a social construction builds from work in the anthropological and sociological fields. Focusing on gender as a social construction, created and reinforced by everyday interactions with one another as well as with social institutions, lay the foundation for us to understand why types of violence such as rape, hazing, and honor killing are so effective and thus, sadly, attractive as tools for maintaining the status quo of social hierarchies. These types of violence further reinforce the marginalization of women, non-ethnic elite men, and LGBTQ populations. We're going to touch more on these ideas throughout the course. The readings for this week are going to present some of the foundational theories for which we will build our more nuanced understandings as we proceed through the gender and violence course. So we're going to start off with West and Zimmerman. Their Doing Gender piece is considered one of the foundational works on gender as a social construction in the sociological literature. Many more scholars will build from this work, as you'll see from this week, Judith Butler draws heavily from them. So it's a great starting point for us. Additionally, it's always handy to understand the genealogy of a scholarly concept. it not only helps us understand the critiques of the theory, it also makes us look super smart when we know where the theory is coming from. So to dig into West and Zimmerman a bit, their understanding of gender, central to their understanding of gender, is the concept of biological differences, what they call sex categories, undergird interactional processes embedded within everyday life. These processes give rise to social categories constructed through these processes. These social categories include gender. Through these processes, individuals quote, do gender, which further reifies the legitimacy of these social constructions. The nexus of their argument is grounded on early work on sex and gender, which was taught through the late 60s and 70s as distinct from one another. So sex was delineated by biology, anatomy, hormones, and physiology, whereas gender was something what West and Zimmerman call an achieved status, that which is constructed through the physiological, the cultural, and social means. West and Zimmerman argue that for a watershed reconceptualization of these early concepts, positing that gender is a routine and reoccurring accomplishment, not something that exists just in society ideas, but through the doing of individual processes around gender norms that are constructed and imposed in society. We're compelled to do gender, and in so doing, we replicate these social norms as our competence as members of society is held hostage, they say, to its production. These processes hold those who engage in it hostage, as it involves a complex of socially guided perceptual, interactional, and micropolitical activities that cast particular pursuits as expressions of the masculine and feminine natures. And what they're really calling attention to here is that these natures aren't actually natural. They're constructed through the social discourse and social norms that we have that we come to understand through our everyday interactions with each other and with social institutions. So we're going to move now to Judith Butler and her book Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity. Butler argues that the social construction of gender is produced through one's reiterated acting in compliance with social norms. She's drawing a lot from concepts that West and Zimmerman lay down, this idea that gender is something performative, something that is done, not something that just exists. For Butler, these norms are constructed discursively. The linguistic frames available to us to discuss and thus construct gender constrain the ways individuals can embody and perform gender. So for example, one of the things that I think about a lot in context of her argument about how gender is constructed discursively is now that we are moving into an era where we have openly gay marriages in many states that are legally sanctioned, our language hasn't actually changed to reflect some of the new statuses that people have around their marriages. We only have the term wife and wife, or husband and husband, whereas partners in same-sex relationships might not actually find that those are the best terms, or that those terms fit just fine for them, but society doesn't necessarily understand where they're coming from when they use terms that have only been constructed for the context of heterosexual marriages. So I bring that up not to necessarily call attention to queer and gay and lesbian theory, but to say that the linguistic frames available to us actually constrain the ways in which we can think about these new concepts of gender. So for Butler, individuals' compliance with the social norms that are constrained by gender further reinforce the legitimacy of these constructions, meaning it makes these structures more invisible and thus seemingly inevitable, which makes them difficult to challenge. If we see these ideas as natural, as something that happens regardless of the ways in which we act and the ways in which we comply with institutions, it makes it much more difficult to challenge these constructions. So Butler builds a lot from West and Zimmerman, this idea of performative gender, and lays the foundation for us to really understand how gender is socially constructed. We're going to move now to Connell, who's going to talk a little bit about the implications of these constructions at the individual level on the societal and institutional level. So Connell says that individuals' compliance with gender norms and the social institutions' reflection of these norms, as in the institutional ways in which we understand how our gender is constrained within the context of social institution, leads to the production of a gender regime, meaning each of our individuals' compliance with these gender norms leads to an institutional gender regime, a pattern of gender relationship or gender arrangements that order individual behavior and institutional functioning. So it's not just that you and I are complying with social norms that tell us how we have to be and how we have to do gender. It's that in the doing of gender in context of those social norms, we are reiterating and reifying a social order that institutionalized disparities between men and women and LGBTQ populations, all of these power relationships vis-a-vis one another. So Connell argues that the gender regime stratifies power along gender binaries, so between men and women. Gender inequality is reproduced through acts that reinforce ethnically elite men's social power and women and ethnic minorities' subjugated statuses. This, Connell argues, gives rise to a gender order of society, which arranges social power disparately among men and women, privileging some men at the exclusion of others, women and other sexual minorities. So Bourdieu gives us some further understandings from what Connell draws attention to on the institutional level. Bourdieu's concept of symbolic violence gives us an understanding of how the individuals who are constrained and subjugated within the gender order actually buy into their own oppression. So Bourdieu, who's a critical theorist from France, highlights the implications of the gender constructions on social power, and this makes it possible for us to analyze how the power dynamics that make gendered violence so effective actually operate. So symbolic violence, Bourdieu says, is the process by which dominated social groups and individuals, quote, buy in to the ways of being and thinking that reinforce the arbitrariness of the social order so that it no longer seems arbitrary, but rather seems natural. And this further justifies the legitimacy of these social structures that privilege some at the exclusion of others. So one of the examples that I like to use when talking about symbolic violence that really paints a picture of how this works is policies and measures that are aimed at reducing gender-based violence such as rape that focus on potential victim behaviors as opposed to the potential aggressors' behaviors. So if you think a lot about rape prevention or sexual violence prevention, a lot of these tactics focus on not wearing short skirts or carrying your car keys in your hand in a dark parking lot, which focuses on how the victims might behave as opposed to the aggressors' behaviors, i.e. don't rape women even if they're wearing short skirts or happen to be not carrying their keys in a way that might hurt you in a parking lot. So by focusing on the victims, we're reinforcing this idea that it's the victim's responsibility to not get raped as opposed to the aggressor's responsibility to not be a rapist. And in so doing, in constructing rape prevention in this way discursively, we're conscribing the dominated to apply categories constructed from the point of view of the dominant, meaning that the dominant social group, in this case men, or I should say institutions that reflect masculine power, reinforce this idea that women need to be compliant and protect themselves as opposed to men need to prevent themselves from becoming rapists. And I'm using the word men here casually, and I don't want to offend the men that are in this class or frankly any of the women that love men. My husband's a great guy. I'm using this to unfortunately, I'm conflating the term, but it's really about the ways in which social institutions are reflective of norms and practices that privilege the masculine at the exclusion of the feminine, that make it possible for men to have male privilege as opposed to women have full access to social norms and social power that would make them be on the same power level as men. So that's Bourdieu's concept of symbolic violence, and he really gives us a framework for understanding not just how these constructions are natural, but how people who are not privileged through these constructions, so people who these constructions actually hurt, how those people buy into these concepts and help reinforce them. So I wanted to move a little bit from the theoretical lenses that we've been talking about and give you some concrete examples. So that's why we read this week from C.J. Pascoe's book, Dude, You're a Fag. So in the book, which is an ethnography that she did at a California high school, and she went to understand how gender and power were replicated at the everyday level in high school. And she used this ethnography because she was interested in seeing these larger dynamics play out at the individual as well as the institutional level. So in the book, she highlights some of the day-to-day social practices that reinforce the gender regime and construct it. And she talks a lot about the hazing that takes place at the high school, and it's a particularly good example for understanding the relationship of gender norms and violence and power because it helps us see how these things play out on not just the individual level, but the ways in which institutional practices, such as not punishing boys for hazing each other, but rather than saying, oh, it's fine, boys will be boys, seeing how those interactional relationships happen at not just the individual level, but the institutional level as well. So it's a great example for understanding how these things play out at both levels and the dynamics between the individual and the institutional. So she really talks about the ways in which masculine dominance is communicated through sexuality and through the institutions and identities and discourses that interact with and are regulated by and produce sexual meanings, meaning the ways in which the everyday practices such as hazing and calling men, dude, you're a fag, if they don't properly, quote unquote, embody masculinity, the ways in which these practices reinforce the idea that the right way to be manly and the right way to have social power is to embody this dominating, physically oppressive type of masculinity. And this also repudiates and devalues anything related to the feminine or the effeminate. And it means, in the context of her ethnography, she shows that this really has implications for the ways in which men and women and sexual minorities can claim social legitimacy within the context of the institution of the school. So I brought Pascoe's work in for the reading this week, mostly to give you some concrete examples of how these larger theoretical frames play out in the everyday. So, to give some concluding thoughts, I wanted to underline the fact that gender is not simply embodied by individuals because it's something natural or inevitable resulting from some biological differences, rather that it's something constructed through the ways in which we interact with society and with each other. Gender is constructed through our individual compliance with social norms that constrain our behaviors and dictate individuals and groups' access to social power, and it's also reinforced through our interactions with societal institutions. And what this means is that gendered violence is used to reinforce the marginalization of women, LGBTQ populations, and non-ethnic elite men because it's so effective at reinforcing the gender order and making it seem natural and inevitable, which makes it much more difficult to challenge. So those are some concluding thoughts for this week's readings. I hope that you enjoyed them. I hope that it gives you a great understanding for furthering your ideas and concepts around gender as a social construction. And I look forward to reading your discussion comments as well as your essay, which is due later this week. Have a great week.